With just a single attack and one missile hitting a nuclear facility, the reactor could potentially melt down, radioactive materials could leak out, or even a disaster worse than Chernobyl could happen. It hasn't been long since the US attacked Iran's nuclear facilities, so the question has come up again. What exactly happens when a missile hits a nuclear facility? Today, we're going to dive into the Iran-Israel conflict and explore what kind of damage an attack on nuclear facilities can cause. Was this issue only a hot topic during those 12 days of war? Do you think everything will go back to normal? Stay with me until the end of this video so we can answer each of these questions. Recently, Israel and the United States carried out several airstrikes on Iran's nuclear facilities at the Natanz, Fordow, and Isfahan sites. Among these, Natanz, which is the largest uranium enrichment facility and is located 225 kilometers from Tehran, was the main target of these attacks and suffered more damage compared to Fordow and Isfahan. Natanz is not just an ordinary site, it's the main engine of Iran's nuclear program. Natanz has an underground commercial fuel enrichment facility and also a pilot facility built above ground. These two can house up to 50,000 centrifuge machines. It's important to know that when we talk about centrifuge machines, we're referring to the devices needed for uranium enrichment. In short, according to reports, the recent attack on the Natanz facility damaged the above-ground building and destroyed all of its power facilities. However, the underground hall remained intact. Still, the power outage might have damaged the centrifuges. This means a serious blow to uranium production. Alright, let's get to know Iran's other two nuclear sites as well. Fordow is an enrichment site that has been dug deep into the heart of a mountain and is probably better protected than the other sites. The 2015 agreement did not allow Iran to carry out enrichment at Fordow at all. Nevertheless, more than 1,000 centrifuges have operated there, including advanced IR-6 machines that can enrich uranium up to 60%. Isfahan also has a large nuclear technology center on the outskirts of the city. This site includes a fuel plate manufacturing plant and uranium conversion facilities, which can convert uranium into uranium hexafluoride that is sent to the centrifuges. Some recent reports clearly indicate that there has been specialized equipment at the Isfahan nuclear site that could potentially use uranium metal for the explicit purpose of making nuclear bombs. However, after the recent Israeli and American attacks on Iran's nuclear sites, Iran announced that no serious damage was done to its facilities, especially the Fordow facility. In fact, the damage was only at ground level and is reparable. Of course, several nuclear organizations both inside and outside Iran have also confirmed that no contamination has been reported from any of the sites. For example, the International Atomic Energy Agency of the United Nations stated that no increase in radiation levels was observed at Iran's key nuclear sites after the US airstrikes. Additionally, Saudi Arabia's Nuclear Regulatory Authority reported that no traces of radioactive materials were detected in the environment of Saudi Arabia or the Gulf countries after the US airstrikes on Iran's nuclear sites. Iran's Atomic Energy Organization also stated that there were no signs of contamination and that there is no danger to residents living near the targeted nuclear sites. So, let's move on to the main question. What happens if a nuclear site suffers serious damage? The international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons says it depends on which part is hit: the reactor, the spent fuel pool, or other sections. For example, if the spent fuel pool catches fire, cesium-137 might be released. This isotope is extremely dangerous, can cause illness, burns, and even death. And what's worse, it can spread for kilometers on the wind. To be more precise, every single million curies, which is the standard unit for precisely measuring radioactive activity, named in honorable recognition of Marie Curie and Pierre Curie, can effectively render about 2,000 square kilometers of land completely uninhabitable. Now, with this crucial information firmly in mind, just imagine how the local people living around the highly sensitive Natanz, Fordow, or Isfahan nuclear sites must have truly felt, and the sheer terror that gripped them for a few agonizing moments when the United States attacked with its formidable B-2 stealth bombers. In these situations, usually the sound of sirens blares, and smoke and fire from the explosions fill the area, while media outlets around the world start broadcasting images of the blasts and widespread threats. People immediately grab masks, and governments put their armies on high alert. But in Iran's case, the International Atomic Energy Agency emphasized that although Natanz has suffered significant damage, no dangerous radiation has been reported from the Natanz site or the Fordow and Isfahan sites. On the other hand, experts say that although radiation levels are currently normal, a leak could still occur. Therefore, it is the duty of the Atomic Agency and the rest of the world to do whatever they can to prevent a disaster from this crisis. Now, to understand the significance of this issue, let's take a look at some of the nuclear disasters in world history. On March 11, 2011, one of the worst nuclear disasters occurred at Japan's Fukushima nuclear power plant. This disaster began when a 9-magnitude earthquake struck, followed by a massive tsunami that knocked out all the cooling systems of the Fukushima reactors. As a result, 3 nuclear reactors melted down and a large amount of radioactive material was released into the air and ocean. The International Atomic Energy Agency classified this incident at the same level as Chernobyl, which is level 7. More than 150,000 people were evacuated from the surrounding areas. Nevertheless, soil, water, and food contamination persisted for years, and its effects are still ongoing. Although Chernobyl has been uninhabitable since the nuclear explosion, some of the original residents returned to their homes after the disaster and have continued to live there under those harsh conditions to this day. Let's go back to April 26, 1986. At 1:23 a.m., the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was located in northern Ukraine, which at that time was part of the Soviet Union. The plant was planning to conduct a simple test. They just wanted to find out how many seconds the turbines could keep generating electricity if the power went out. But the reactor's design and human errors became problematic. Reactor number 4, which was supposed to be used for the test, had an issue that even the Russians didn't want to admit. The RBMK-1000 reactor became extremely unstable when its power level dropped. That means if the power dropped or certain conditions occurred, there was a chance the whole reactor could blow up. During this test, the technicians bypassed several safety protocols. It was kind of like they said, "Forget it, let's just do the test and get it over with." As a result, when they pressed the AZ5 button, which was the emergency reactor shutdown button, not only did the reactor not shut down, but it exploded in a terrifying way. Smoke, fire, and most importantly, radioactive materials were thrown into the air. Chernobyl turned into a real ticking time bomb. When the reactor exploded, radioactive materials like cesium-137, iodine-131, and strontium-90 were dispersed into the atmosphere and carried by the wind for thousands of kilometers, reaching as far as the Scandinavian countries, where they also detected the radiation. You should know that iodine-131 is extremely dangerous for the thyroid, and thousands of Ukrainian and Belarusian children develop thyroid cancer. On the other hand, cesium-137 remains active for up to 30 years, and wherever it lands, it destroys the land in that area. What's worse is that after the incident, firefighters entered the area without any protective clothing because they had no idea what they were dealing with. Many of them were burned or died from severe radioactive poisoning within the very first hours, but the effects of this disaster lasted for years. Chernobyl is now an exclusion zone, meaning it's an area of about 30 square kilometers where no one is allowed to live. The exploded reactor is now covered by a giant concrete sarcophagus. Because the reactor is still dangerous, and this structure has to protect it for at least 100 years. Apart from Chernobyl and Fukushima, which are probably the most famous nuclear incidents in the world, there have been other nuclear disasters as well. On March 28, 1979, one of the biggest nuclear incidents in American history occurred. Reactor number 2 suffered a failure in its cooling system, and part of the reactor core melted down. There is still disagreement about the impact of this incident on people's health. But the reality is that Americans' trust in nuclear energy was severely shaken after that. You should know that before Chernobyl, the Soviet Union was responsible for another disaster that didn't get as much attention. On September 29, 1957, the Mayak nuclear facility in the Soviet Union suffered a nuclear accident. The storage tank containing nuclear waste overheated and exploded. Around 200 people died instantly, and about 100,000 were forced to evacuate. But the Soviet government kept silent, and it wasn't until the 1980s that the world finally learned what had happened. Let's go back to Japan again. In 1999, a simple human error caused a disaster. 2 workers accidentally poured too much uranium into a tank, which triggered a nuclear chain reaction. Not only did these 2 workers lose their own lives, but they also exposed hundreds of others to radiation. Apart from the examples we've mentioned, you should know that a nuclear disaster doesn't always involve an explosion. Sometimes even a small leak or a mistake in disposing of radioactive waste can have negative effects lasting thousands of years. Moreover, if there is a disruption in the uranium enrichment process, which nuclear facilities especially use for electricity generation, it can release radioactive materials into the air, leading to consequences such as environmental contamination, radiation-related illnesses, and even numerous deaths. On the other hand, aside from these issues, geopolitical risks can also be catastrophic. An attack on nuclear facilities not only creates domestic and humanitarian problems, but could also trigger a geopolitical crisis and even lead to World War III, because an attack on a country's nuclear facilities could provoke a retaliatory response from that country and even intervention from other nations. Of course, in such complex and dynamic situations, various intricate scenarios can potentially arise, which we'll discuss further in the following sections. One of the most significant and serious threats to critical nuclear facilities is undoubtedly sophisticated cyberattacks. In recent years, we've witnessed various cyberattacks that have disrupted the security and information systems of countries. If such attacks target the control systems of a nuclear reactor, the reactor could be severely damaged and major risks could arise. Therefore, major countries are actively working to strengthen their robust cybersecurity systems to effectively minimize such potential threats. But this risk is always present. A real or missile attack on nuclear facilities is considered one of the most serious threats. In this way, although the attacks by Israel and the US on Iran's nuclear facilities haven't yet caused a disaster, they could be a ticking time bomb. On the other hand, if other countries also get involved in a world war, an attack on North Korea's nuclear facilities could bring endless dangers as well. Therefore, even if a missile can't completely destroy a nuclear facility, it can still cause widespread contamination. On the other hand, in countries with unstable political conditions, any kind of uprising or internal crisis could lead to attacks on nuclear facilities. In fact, such attacks might be the result of internal tensions or even internal pressures. But overall, attacking nuclear facilities is one of the most dangerous possible scenarios in today's world, which not only could lead to the destruction of millions of people, but could also trigger a full-scale world war. In any case, to prevent such incidents, we need to focus more on global nuclear security, because in this world full of tension and political rivalries, the only way to avoid such disasters is through international cooperation and strengthening nuclear security. What do you think? Write in the comments whether you think using nuclear energy is still worth the risk. And if you were in charge of security at a nuclear site, What would you do to prevent attacks on nuclear facilities? Nuclear energy is a tremendous blessing, but if you're not careful, it can turn into a global curse. Chernobyl and Fukushima taught us some very costly lessons, and now, with attacks on nuclear sites in the Middle East, the fear of those disasters repeating has come back to life. In fact, you could say that throughout history, nuclear facilities have always been under strict supervision and extremely high security protection. But in today's world, because of global tensions and competition between countries, these facilities have become a tempting target for terrorist groups, governments, and even individuals with political motives. To prevent such crises, we need greater awareness and cooperation among the countries of the world. However, how exactly we should go about preventing such crises is a question that needs to be considered carefully and from different perspectives. Let's remember that nuclear security is a combination of physical, diplomatic, and cyber measures. Therefore, the world must unite to secure the entire global nuclear infrastructure in order to prevent the next possible disaster.